This is more so from a management perspective in my experience here. So if you were looking for the technical, here you go. He would be, I guess, my counterpart in the next session if you want to hear about the technical ins and outs. But this really is about my experience in leading a lot of efforts and communities and organizations and individuals kicking and dragging sometimes into Drupal. So I have named this, I'm leaving you the risk of dumping your old CMS and how to manage them. So I am Nicole Lind. I am the Senior Vice President of Treehouse Agency. I have been with them for about 2 years. And prior to that, I go back, my first Drupal project was about 5 years ago in managing the lifetime effort. And then I worked on Vast Company. And I then worked on like a series of other large sites, and they talked about Department of Energy. I think that was my last real big push or migration or cultural shock change. So let's get started. So why this session? There are, ooh, how weird. I got a weird, I didn't have before. But essentially it said managing expectations at this point. So why this session? That there are a lot of dangers that lurk in doing a migration project, and that yes, people get all excited and say, oh, we're going to Drupal, but it's not as easy as you think, and for those of you who've already gone down this path, you know it already. There is generally a drain on resources, change is difficult, and that there are unrecognized risks. There are a whole lot of other reasons why I did it, but those are the main ones. So the goal of this session is to help you learn to set better expectations for the people that you are working with or working for you, to provide a risk assessment framework, to minimize surprises, and most importantly, and I use a little bit of humor later on, is to bring sanity to a very potentially stressful situation. So this is a lot of text. But basically, one of the things I found in any migration effort or move to Drupal or new Drupal CMS is understanding the language and the people. And that I came up with two terms, and that one is, I call it Drupal doublespeak, and it's generally language that disguises or distorts or reverses the meaning of words. And so you might have the words like downsizing, when in fact, you're firing a bunch of folks. And then tribalism is essentially a strong or cultural ethnic identity that separates one member of a group from another. Why would I put these two words in here? And I will start to explain. So understanding Drupal's doublespeak. And these are common everyday ones that I'm sure you've heard. And the first one being, there is a module for that. And this one I always find funny in that it, essentially what a client may be telling you or a developer's telling you is that, oh, it's almost already built. You don't have to worry about it. And that, of course, you're still going to need plenty of development time to actually get it to work the way that your client or users actually think that it's supposed to work. So that's the first doublespeak term. Final designs. I love this one. I've had actual designers, and I'm sorry to offend any designers out there, where it's final designs, final designs, final designs version 7, final designs part 1. It's cool, but it just understand that final designs, there are generally ongoing tweaks that occur to the designs, and that and then just on the technical side and on the project management side, understanding that even small design changes could potentially change the functionality. So just being clear. Flexibility. I've started to hear this one a lot when working with clients who are moving, and for the big group who's doing Vignette. I don't know if they're throwing this one around a lot, that Drupal's so flexible, you're gonna love it. That is true, very, very true. But there is an expectation that comes with the word flexibility, is that your users who were using the other system, particularly if it was something like a Vignette that has been out in the market for a very long period of time and is not, quote, as flexible, there's going to be an expectation that it operate like shrink-wrapped, out-of-the-box software. Drupal is not that, for all of you who know that. And to get it, yes, we can do out-of-the-box implementations, but oftentimes sites want their own theme and they want their own functionality, and it in fact will not operate like out-of-the-box shrink-wrap software. So flexibility, be careful with that word, and I'll talk about how to minimize and set expectations around this word. Cost savings. And for those of you who saw my presentation yesterday, my co-presenter talked endlessly about the cost savings that they're going to experience. And that when I see cost savings analysis and they talk about Drupal, that yes, you are no longer paying for the software. You may have, you're getting rid of your Oracle licenses, you're getting rid of your SQL licenses, yay! But guess what? All of a sudden, you're ramping up on trying to get Drupal talent. How hard is that for a lot of folks? They're very expensive, they're hard to obtain, they're hard to hold on to. There's often major changes in your hosting platform, which also involve costs. So just costs vary when you're doing a migration project, and that when you're selling your project or you're doing your project, just be mindful that there are other costs other than just the lack of software costs for Drupal. There's talent all over the world. I hear this a lot as well, is that any of you who are working and having to shop out to, say, an offshore company, I use offshore quite a bit, particularly for QA, for kind of simple modules, but translating really difficult user requirements to an offshore company is very difficult. And sometimes you end up spending more money. And that's not even just offshore. Treehouse is a virtual company. Even being virtual is difficult in this model, is that there's talent all over the country, and we actually utilize talent everywhere. And that we just have some clients that are just not cool with that. And they know that what happens in a room when you're sitting down, kind of exchanging ideas and requirements, that face-to-face is very valuable. So again, the talent all over the world model can apply to just being, in the United States as well and working virtually. Critical launch issue. I hear this one often. We love this one. I mean, none of this is rocket science. It's just the language and being aware that there's language, and later, mitigating these language issues. I love getting tickets regardless of what your ticketing system is, or you have a client picking up the phone or a user picking up the phone, and somehow the font is off, or somehow, the design is slightly off, and it is a critical launch issue, and everyone must drop everything. Well, the unfortunate problem is that sometimes, at least the way I've interpreted critical launch issue, is that we can't launch unless, or the site is down, or there's a fundamental problem in the technology. But again, it's managing and working with your community of users and understanding what truly is a critical launch issue. And oftentimes I find they're kind of funny, some of the issues that come forward at the last minute. So that's the language. So there is a tribal community, as I call it, and often when there is a kind of entrenched legacy community, these are the roles that I find pop up often, and they all have to be managed. So I'm going to go through each one. The evangelist member. This is probably the person, not probably, is the person who brought Drupal, who was the cheerleader and said, Drupal, we need to do Drupal, we need to do Drupal. The only problem with this role, and they're a great role to have on a project, is that they often oversell Drupal. And you have to be very mindful of how they sold it and what they're going to get. And you have to be mindful of all the doublespeak language they were using. So if they were saying Drupal is highly flexible, you're going to be able to do all of this stuff, just track it down, see what they sold, see what they're saying to your organization, and then just manage those expectations and just bring everybody back into reality. It's very important, because I've worked on a lot of projects where there was an evangelist who really sold Drupal, and then the product launched, and everyone was like, well, that's not what we thought we were getting. So, very important. Second one is the passive aggressive. And this is a funny role, and they kind of make me crazy a little bit, is that you can be sitting in a room, and this is the person who's going to yes you to death, but then go behind your back and do everything differently. And that this is a hard role to deal with, only because they're very subversive. They'll send like an email that's kind of undermining, or they're having conversations that you're hearing about where you were just sitting in a meeting with them and they were yesing you to death. So what do you do about this person? I mean, does everyone kind of know this role, or have they experienced it? Okay, they're shaking their head, yes. it is very important to point out the inconsistency in their behavior. Didn't I just hear you in a meeting agree to X, Y, and Z, and now your behavior is doing, A, B, and C? Very important to call them out. If you are not calling this member out, they can destroy a project. And you don't even know it. You wake up one morning and why is my project all misaligned? Because you have passive-aggressive behavior often in members of your community during a migration. The openly hostile. This is definitely the person who is going to tell you or is telling you all along that Drupal's a bad idea. And I've usually have one of these. They're often motivated by jealousy, and they often think that they are the person who should be leading the project. In this case, what I usually do with the openly hostile person immediately is I give them a really important job in the project that they can feel proud of and participate in, or I completely eliminate them. If I can't give them an important job, they're going to just all the way down the aisle as you're trying to migrate. The know-it-all. This is usually a very experienced technical person, but they are new to Drupal. So they are motivated by fear. And they're going to complain about all the inadequacies of Drupal. And yes, there are inadequacies. And so if they're a Java developer, and no offense to any previous Java developers, or if you are a Java developer, for some reason these are always Java developers for me. And that what you do here, and we talked about it yesterday, is you have to train these folks. If you do not train them, you will lose them. And your desire could be to just lose them and let them quit or leave or be unhappy and discontented. But if in fact you really value this member, this technical member, and they do have quite a bit of technical experience, is train them. The apathetic. These are the sideliners. They don't say much, they don't care, they could care less. Unfortunately, it's usually your editorial staff who sits by, gives no feedback, you put the new CMS in front of them, and they go ballistic. Very important in this case is to actually drag them along, kicking and screaming if you have to, because they are kind of lazy and they don't want to necessarily put all the effort out. They don't think it's a big deal, but all of a sudden their entire world is going to turn upside down when you put a Drupal CMS in front of them, which is completely different than many of the kind of legacy systems. They're going to go crazy. So what I usually do with this group is I do a lot of preview demos, and I try to get them test accounts as early as possible. So if my articles are ready first and the whole CMS is not done, I put them on articles and I get them used to playing with articles. Once the blogs are done, I get them used to playing with blogs. Slideshows are done, I get them used to playing with slideshows. Do it as early as possible so they get, because Drupal has a certain metaphor for using the CMS. And it's, like I said, it's often very different. So do not wait until the last minute to bring this group along. The protector. This is usually the keeper of the budget. And sometimes it's unclear identifying who this person is. So you may have a finance person that you think who's kind of holding on to the money. And it can be a CIO, it could be a CTO. I've had it be a production person who was kind of yaying or naying an expenditure. In this case, make this member your friend. Take them to dinner, take them to drinks, and schmooze as much as possible. There's nothing better in a migration project to know who your friends are and who's controlling the money and the resources. And that if in fact this person is your friend, they will protect you to the end of this project and make sure you have what you need. And last but not least in the Drupal tribe member roles this is the mover and shaker, the chief. This is the person who understands the strategy, the language, and the players associated with getting the job done. They're not always liked, and they may be very hard on other tribe members. But very importantly, if you are not the chief, or you're the person responsible for identifying the chief, or you have to work with the chief, empower this member with authority. I have seen projects go completely astray because there is a chief who does not have any power or authority. And it's very different. I don't know if that makes sense. It may be a project manager who holds a title, but they don't really have any enforcement capabilities. They can't throw anybody off the project. They can't impact the timeline. They can't do much of anything. So definitely empower your chief so that they can get what needs to get done in the project. So understanding change in the Drupal tribal community. That change is really hard for people. It is truly very hard. And that as I said, putting a new CMS in front of folks often could result in them losing their jobs and restructuring the organization. I've seen it. Like I said, the large project I worked on, the Department of Energy, we did a pilot site. We did 14 sites, and all 14 of those sites, and there's like 500 more to go, they were terrified. Their internal development teams, their internal designers all thought, that they were losing their jobs, and they potentially may be. This is where they're actually identifying where the cuts could be. So this is who you're working with when you're doing a Drupal migration project. Speed of change. If you can, and unfortunately it's never the case, because web projects always have kind of like I need it tomorrow, time to market issues. If you can introduce change as slowly as possible, that helps. But it usually doesn't happen. And that different people act differently to change. Understanding your various roles in the background, some people will be more flexible than others. And then last but not least, which goes into the next part of the presentation, is change is inherently risky. And this is in fact why I titled this presentation, is that doing a migration project, as I said, is inherently risky. So what we're going to do is try to evolve people and language through risk assessment. And this is kind of like a high-level concept in that kind of matching kind of my cultural stuff with people and language to more scientific methods of measuring risk. And that, unfortunately, some of these slides have tiny little, I haven't gotten to them yet, so I will try to explain them as best I can. So in a Drupal migration project, or any migration project, identifying the most common risk. And the one that I found first and foremost that is, it's a very high risk if the organization or people do not have any experience with Drupal whatsoever. Really hard, because it's a conceptual change, it's a metaphor change, is that very hard. Unknown dependencies, these are all typical. Scheduling, double data entry, you're building out 2 systems. You have one still in production. You have production staff who has to keep the old site running while you're building the new site, and then you have to be seeding the new site with content. What's the plan around that? That's always fun. Unidentified block behavior. Don't you love the wireframes that you get with the boxes on it, and then it just kind of has a short description, most popular, and it never tells you how most popular is decided. None of that. So that's a big risk in a Drupal project. Other legacy systems have no clear migration path. Department of Energy was on something called Red Dot. No migration path. All static HTML files. It was painful. And then it was actually a manual migration, and they just had to accept it. And then we had to build time into the schedule to actually have them cut and paste their articles. And yes?
There are solutions for that.
For Red Dot?
I will talk about that.
I will have to come to that because I need to. We just literally, just a side note, it was Treehouse, Acquia, and we sat there and racked our brains for 2 months trying to figure it out, and we couldn't find one. Huh?
Query path.
All right, we'll talk.
We'll talk about this last one too.
Lack
of clear content.
Thank you. But again, if what we are looking for are solutions out there to these problems, but they are inherently risky because they're not always clear. And you're going to need some really great engineers to figure this stuff out for you. And some systems actually clearly map. They're very easy.
But I mean, not to...
Jump in.
Though the engineers can't do that in a vacuum. And the first
Yep.
thing you should demand of your engineers is a content mapping plan written in plain English
Yep.
that you can approve.
Yep.
Because what I think is a widget is not what Red Dot thinks is a widget.
Yep.
And I need to know that.
Yep.
So.
Yep, we spent a lot of time. The content mapping problem was a little easier to solve, which we did on DOE, but we weren't able to solve the migration, and they ended up doing a manual. So, and then of course, potential impacts. All of these things have a potential impact on cost, schedule, and performance of your overall project or product. So, aside from the common risks that I just identified, you should additionally survey your community. And that when I say survey your community, it's also survey your developers and your hosting staff, because often, for some reason or another, everybody talks to the business owners, but for some reason they're not talking to the technical staff, and I don't know why they do that. And that there are a lot of budget issues that will sit inside that technical and hosting staff that are not often assumed in a project budget. They're assuming like all the design and development, but never necessarily the hardware and hosting. And then also, as I had mentioned before, those apathetic editors who generally don't want to participate, spend time with them and spend significant time and walking them through, as again, in the demos, understanding what their processes are. This is a big payoff for you in the end. Do understand how they expect to interface with their workflows, with their permissions. I mean, very important. Setting up a risk tracking method. And here, there are thousands of formats on the web. If you literally go in and just type risk analysis or risk assessment, they're going to give you a bunch of standard formats. So just those two keywords, and you'll find you can download Excel spreadsheets that will already be set up and with all the mappings that I'll show you, and that they're often and always usually tracking things like likelihood and impact, which I will explain. And of course, the impact being financial, timeline, or quality of the outcome. So these are, you do not have to use these, but this is generally how I break my risk down in terms of likelihood. Almost certain that it's 95% going to happen. I know it's going to happen. In DOE, essentially, we could not migrate. It was a risk, and it was on there, and it was listed as likely. Or almost certain, excuse me. Likely 65 to 95%, and this is all subjective, but again, it's putting some classification around your risk. Possible, 35 to 65%, unlikely, 5 to 35%, and rare. And why do you want to do all of this? It's simply because you want to be able to evaluate the impact on your project. And that's, again, the impact being financial, timeline, or quality of the outcome. And that impact could be very serious. And again, very subjective, depending on your community or organization. You're going to draft these sections, and these are small and they're not necessarily important, but I'll read through a little bit of them. Is one, I have very serious for me, an event whose occurrence will impact the project's cost, schedule, or feature so that the project will be terminated, that the project will not happen. Your migration project will be shut down. That is a very serious impact on a project. Serious is in this case, it's more than 10% delay in schedule, increase in budget, or impact, or basically your end users are going to say, I'm not getting the product that I expected. You're giving them a product. It's not very serious where they're not getting nothing. They're going to get something here, but they're not going to be happy about it. That's serious. Moderate is oftentimes it is change in a project, but it's manageable. And here, minor, it's just being aware. And you may not want to do anything about it. You're putting it down here. A minor could potentially be something like, what? I'm trying to think. Actually, I have examples of minor in here. Actually, yes. I have one here, unnecessary project hours, budget spent waiting for stakeholder approvals. That happens a lot in a project. Sometimes it's very serious. Sometimes it's serious. Sometimes it's in my case, on a lot of my projects, when I have developers sitting around waiting for them, for sign off, and that I usually find other stuff for them to do, or but again, that's depending on how your organization's set up. We happen to be an agency, so it's easy for me to shuffle my developers around onto other project work while I wait. It may not be as easy for the rest of you. So from my perspective, waiting around is often a minor problem. It likely happens, but minor. Another one I have is emerging requirements after discovery completed, which can impact timeline, budget, and quality. Does this happen? Yeah, it always happens usually. It's very frequent. The impact is how you manage it, and I usually label this as a moderate problem. Hosting solution is not approved as of yet. This happened in DOE. We waited and waited and waited and waited, and it was almost certain, and I actually wrote the risk assessment plan after the date of the hosting was supposed to be decided on. So almost certain it already happened. And it was very serious, and it did impact timeline at that point, more than 10%. It pushed out our launch schedule. And this one is no clear migration path, and existing content from old CMS, which puts timeline at significant risk. It was almost certain, and it was a serious impact. So this is how you would start to structure a risk plan. And I don't know how familiar most of you are with it, but I generally do this for every project that I work on. Sometimes it could only be 4 risks that I identify. Sometimes I have pages of pages and I'm tracking them through the entire project. And so creating a risk mitigation plan for Drupal migration projects. Essentially common sense plans. I like to have this kind of out of the bucket plans that you just pull out, but you don't have to sit around and think about for a long time. Set clear and measurable goals. Very important. And then I will have a slide right after this that will show you this. Conduct a project discovery, provide as much training and documentation as your budget and schedule allows. But I actually have detailed slides for each of these. So setting clear and measurable goals. And working on a project, don't you love those really unclear ones? We are moving to Drupal because we want our CMS to be more flexible. Remember I talked about the word flexible? What does that really mean? Like measurably. How do you measure that? Unfortunately, you have to figure that out. And you have to quantify it somehow through your interfaces, your wireframes, and what you're doing in your CMS so that everyone feels that they got their flexible Drupal CMS. It has to be quantifiable. So break it down. Not specific. We expect to save a lot of money moving to Drupal. How much money? In what areas? Over what period of time? Very specific. And unrealistic. I've had this on a project, truly. One of the main goals of this project is to double our traffic the first month after we've launched. I love that. I was like, most migration projects actually result in a small dip, sometimes a large dip in traffic. So this was fairly unrealistic, and I had to break the news to the client and then work with them. And we were like the technology team. We were not the business strategist or anything. It was just, again, managing risk and expectations, is that we could actually build the product that they actually asked for, but because it didn't double its traffic, we become the sitting ducks of putting out, a bad product. And that has happened. So goals need to be specific and realistic to help expectations for success of the project. So, oh yes.
What is the reason for the dip? Is it because
the what?
The dip in traffic is because visitors are unfamiliar with the
Sometimes the dip, it's for various reasons. I've seen the dip happen because there wasn't maybe a clear understanding of how much content was being produced, say in the old system, and the frequencies, and that they weren't. So oftentimes, back to content mapping, there may be a lot of time spent saying, okay, we need articles, we need blogs, we need this, we need that, but they don't really think about the frequency of how often they have to produce this new content.
Right. They're just thinking like, we have a new site, it's up, it's ready,
They have to keep it rolling. And so I worked on the Fast Company launch, and they had a dramatic dip after launch. And their dramatic dip was simply because they were not producing enough content at that point. And sometimes they result in that, and this is kind of a technical and business problem where there's kind of a URL mapping and strategy and redirect strategy. So there are a lot of things that go into why there are dips in traffic. Again, a lot of them can be mitigated. But once again, expecting double the amount of traffic, unless you're actually putting commercials out on, NBC, ABC, and CBS saying, hey, we have a new site, that expectation is usually not, a real one. So, welcome. Project discovery. I love project discoveries, and I know for smaller groups or organizations that are putting out product after product, or you're in major maintenance mode, to actually get people to sit around and talk about what you're going to do for some period of time is hard to get them to do it. If you're an agency like we are, convincing your client that they should pay for this time. This is hard, because most times people only want to pay for the build time. They don't want to pay for the talking and kind of sitting and thinking about how we're going to do things. But even if it's small, like just a couple days, or if you can get a couple of meetings, just to get your group focused on what you're actually truly doing. What are the real needs? Saying I want to move to Drupal is not a real need. That's fluff. You're like, why do you want to move to Drupal? What business problems is it going to actually solve for you? And so getting into why you're doing it is very important to understanding actually how your rollout is going to occur. And that sometimes, when I'll have clients say, oh, I want an out-of-the-box solution, you don't have to worry about the administrative tools. And once again, They always kind of come back to bite you in the behind because, you know, they didn't really understand what their needs were up front, and they didn't discuss them. They just thought they needed to be on Drupal and didn't really understand what kind of an out-of-box solution. So discoveries are really important, and then I know they are hard to get and structure and organize, but again, they can be as short or as long as you need, but just do one, get that time together. And this is probably one of the most significant ways to minimize your risk in a project, to actually bring all those tribal members together and get them kind of buying into what's happening and understanding what's happening to them, getting them used to the kind of change that's going to occur. This can all happen during your discovery period. Training and documentation. There's endless workshops and stuff out there on training and documentation. I just put this one in here because it is a standard mitigation for risk, in that unfortunately budgets and timelines usually don't accommodate the real need. So I just put a more efficient delivery for training. I create inline documentation as much as possible within the CMS. I find a lot of organizations spend time trying to create manuals, and those are really hard to keep up to date and keep distributed. If you're just essentially doing it within the CMS, it's just one place. So it usually saves a lot of time. But again, back to your tribal members, some of your old legacy people just have to have that manual. If they do not have the paper in their hands, they are not happy. They just feel that you have not delivered a completed CMS to them if it does not come with a manual. You will have to work with them. And usually it's the openly hostile members that, for whatever reason, are the ones complaining the most about the manual. And I mentioned this before, I do regular demos for our stakeholders on functionality, which is keeping them up to speed. I often record them sometimes, and they're able to take those recordings where I'm showing, hey, this is how, you know, this is your article template now. This is how you're going to use, you know, these landing pages. This is how you're going to, we record them, and they can distribute those videos out as a training mechanism for everybody who's not, say, as close to the project early on. So they can see, you know, how using the actual tools in a video works. It saves a lot of time. And then this is just a no-brainer, maintaining a central repository for all your documents. I mean, I don't care what it is. Google Docs, Basecamp, whatever. I just don't know how many times I sit on a project and everybody's running around, you know, can you find that document, and where an email? And I still do it, but those are just 3 common mitigation plans that I use for training and documentation. So, putting it all together. Here it is all together. These were the 4 risks that I had identified before, and I had unnecessary project about the developer sitting around waiting for stakeholder approval. I said likely, minor. Did I decide to mitigate it? No, checked it off the list. I had emerging requirements after discovery. Yes, it's likely to happen. It's moderate. And yes, I decided to mitigate this one. And I decided to mitigate it by implementing a ticketing system that tracks change to features. Systems should be able to identify bugs from improvement request. It's very simple. Everyone knows this is how it's going to be done. And what's so funny, often clients are, like, they appreciate that. They like to see, like, let me rephrase. Oftentimes, end users of a system can't tell the difference between a bug and an improvement. And it's very helpful when they can see the list of requests that they have that determine, no, this is a bug and this is a feature request. So this is what I use, and I sometimes take that printout, I will go into a meeting, I will have a developer with me, I will sit and explain, this is why this is a new feature request, we'll go back and reference the wireframes, we'll go back and reference the designs, but I have this list that is tracking it for them. If you do not have this list, it gets very messy. Yes?
My sort of related question is how are you doing acceptance testing?
Ooh, I put an extra, this is side, I put an extra layer in the ticketing, in that depending on the ticketing system you're using, sometimes our clients make us use whatever they're, like Bugzilla or whatever. So Jira, if I have my preference for ticketing, I'll use Jira. And I'll probably put a workflow in there where a ticket can't get closed until I have the user who can do like in my project brief, I've identified who can accept the product. That's first and foremost.
Right.
Oddly enough, that's sometimes unclear in a project. Who can actually do the acceptance on the product? But once that's clear, or their empowered member, because it may not, the acceptance may be some VP or whoever, they may have some underling doing the acceptance, but if they're in the ticketing system, which I usually make them go, I make them actually say accept on the feature. And I make them click it, because if they do not click it, there's always that back and forth that occurs. Did they really accept this? And I sometimes even make them sign off.
I think the question
Yeah.
is also, what's the language in the ticket so that people know you're talking about the same thing when you say?
This is getting way down into the tracking. I'm having this on a project right now. I have the developers emerging with a list of their interpretation of the requirements. I have the business over here with their list of requirements. So the developers have like an architectural understanding of what's getting ready to happen. They don't have any ticket called article or blog. They don't, because they're taking care of it within some larger development framework. And their language of their tickets are very different than the language of the tickets that are on the business side. So essentially what I do, and there's some argument this has not been accepted everywhere where I go, is that I let the developers do it the way that they want to do it, because it's faster and it's more efficient, and I let them talk to each other the way they want to do it. I then go in and create a whole new other set of tickets for the business that say article, that say blog, like blog feature, based on what they described of their expectation for blog feature. And then when they start going through and doing their acceptance, all the bugs are actually tracked against the business ticket. And that once all the bugs are closed, they'll go through, because they have a ticket that they can understand. So I unfortunately have to create two sets of, well, I have developers create tickets and they can go to town, but then I create business tickets.
We have parent tickets.
We do parent tickets as well, but I found with even parent tickets, they get too complicated for the business folks to really follow. So I separate them out. They just become too unruly at that point to keep track of. And if they sit and look at all the developers speak in a ticket, they have no idea what's going on. And they're like, what do you expect me to do about this? And I keep them separate. I keep them in the same project in a ticketing system, but I have a whole other set of tickets for them. So hosting solution is not approved as of yet. Almost certain, very serious. Yes, decided to migrate. And in this case, we pushed out the launch for 3 weeks. There was no other way. Had to be communicated to the business and the stakeholders and let them all know. That's an unfortunate outcome when you're mitigating a risk, that there is no other way. You cannot jump through any more holes or loops or whatever to get through it. You're either going to have to go deliver some bad news that it's going to cost you an extra whatever, you're going to push your timeline, or you're going to have to give up some feature set. That is usually the result of an almost certain and very serious risk. And last but not least is not a clear migration path for the content. Almost certain, serious, yes. We started looking for outside vendors that specialize in it, but they didn't want to pay. And they were willing to do it manually. I was like, okay, that's a acceptable mitigation plan for me, as long as the client accepts it. Distributing and pushing plans, risk plans out. And this is just kind of simple stuff here. The initial risk assessment should be placed in the project discovery documentation if one is in fact conducted. Please identify your risk to your users. They need to know. And that I usually share it out in my meetings, in my scrums. I send them out in emails, Google Docs, whatever. Distribute the risk. Make sure people understand. This is the way that you're keeping control of a very uncontrollable, potentially uncontrollable project. And my final thoughts here is be very patient. Migration projects to Drupal are very, very, they're stressful for a lot of folks, particularly coming, as I said, from legacy systems, and you have all that tribal behavior, all that double-speak language. There's a lot going on in a project. If you lose your cool, you're going to potentially lose control of your effort. Understand that the people and language of the people who are actually moving to Drupal. Get to know them. Understand what their needs and concerns are. Understand that they fear change. All the stuff that I talked about in my earlier slides. And again, be sensitive to how they deal with change. And last but not least, and I always say this, is that, again, as a project manager, I manage to schedules, and I do manage to budgets, and I do manage to the quality of the product that I'm responsible for pushing through. But most importantly, I find managing to risk is actually how you evolve your community to doing a true, a successful Drupal migration project. So that is my presentation. And is there any questions?
Please remember to repeat the question.
Yes, thank you, because I'd already forgot. Okay. Questions? Although people were asking them all throughout the presentation, so it's okay if there are not.
I'm wondering about the process and tools that your users of the new Drupal system are going to be using. If they're used to a different CMS, maybe they have been customized over a period of time to give them a lot of really custom workflows. How that fits into your project plan. I think, looking at one of the projects that I've done, we didn't spend enough time mapping out custom tools
Right.
those customers were going to need, were going to want. Even if there was a way to make it happen out of box Drupal, it wasn't anticipated, and I just wonder if that's a part of, is that one of the risks that you run across, the tools needed and the process and workflow aspect?
Let me repeat so that they have it for video, and as best as I can, and correct me where the question basically is how am I accommodating the tools that the users are using on the on the legacy CMS, and how do we account for that, say, in the Drupal CMS? I touch on it here a lot about spending enough time with them, but okay, what is spending enough time with them? What are you actually doing with them during this time? I do a few things with the group to kind of flush it out, and one is I usually walk through, as long as my previous clients are okay, I will walk them through the workflows of some of my existing implementations on Drupal, which is like generally mind-blowing for them. That is one of the best ways that you can flush out their needs, when they in fact see how someone else is using the system already. That's number one. Number two, I actually always make them walk me through. I will sit at their desk, I will have developers sit at their desk, and they will walk me through their current workflow several times. They will show me their tools, they will show me how they put their content together, and I'll watch them, and I will ask them questions like, well, is there something you wished you could do in this that you can't currently do? How is your process being impeded? What's slowing you down in your current system? And I jot all those notes down. So that's the second thing that I do, and it is standard that I always get a existing walkthrough. And third, if I can't necessarily show my existing clients, I will do an out-of-the-box install of Drupal and just show them what it looks like, particularly if they're new to Drupal, just so that they can play with it. And that the street, Justin, we didn't talk about it yesterday, but he presented with me. We did that there. Their business people had never, ever seen anything like Drupal. And so we basically had a basic install for them that we gave them test accounts on and let them play with it a little bit. And we would sit and walk them through and say, oh, you can do this with it. And they were like, oh, really? Well, can I? And then they would go show us, they would log into their CMS and they're like, well, this is the problem I have here. You have to create the dialogue with not wireframes and designs, because those are not alive enough for them. You have to put them on real tools. So that's how I generally flesh out the issues. And that, oddly enough, before I started doing that, we were never hitting the mark. Now that we do that every time, we seem to be hitting the mark every time with our clients in terms of their expected behavior on the CMS. Now, they don't like the bugs that come along with Drupal, but that's another story. But we are catching their wants and desires for their administrative tools. And we sometimes even wireframe the administrative tools for them. That's another technique. Well, if it's especially complicated, we'll wire up their expectations and show them the wires. And sometimes we even prototype. There's a lot of things that you can do.
Going back to the question before about what can cause a dip in the traffic when you switch over from one site to another, actually do any kind of checking of what exists in the search engines at this point as far as the URLs that exist out there? I mean, as compared to actually the URLs of one system and mapping those into the new one, you have
Yes.
so many things that can go back even like 10 years.
Yep, that's what happened at Fast Company. That was another problem, but you know how that one got fixed at Fast, that was the key problem at Fast Company. And how that was solved is we actually, and they were here at the conference, we hired Valachi. And they came in and did an entire audit of like the content and all of the linking backs and how they had all been broken completely with the relaunch. And that they, we sit more on the technical side, and that we don't kind of climb, we'll do kind of the URL mapping where we know it, but we can't do it in a vacuum per se. But in that case, it starts to, in some cases, slip over into an SEO issue, and that's exactly what happened with Fast Company. And Valachi came in and did an entire assessment, gave 10 recommendations on how to fix stuff, which is somewhat outside of kind of the realm of what we do. But yeah, we brought in an expert to fix that problem. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of, like, in civil engineering projects, people, like building bridges, often expect things to go over budget time by 2 times. This project, is a rule of thumb, it's like something crazy. Do you have an idea of, like, in general for Drupal, migrating to Drupal, like, is there some expected ratio of, like, what people predict and what actually happens in terms of time and money?
Good question. Question repeating. In a Drupal migration project, is there some kind of expected overage in terms of time and money, like in a civil engineering project, expecting that building a bridge is going to cost you twice as much and run twice as long? What I would say is my early life in Drupal, there was that expectation. There was, there was no scientific evidence, but all the projects I was working on were all running completely over budget and completely over timeline. In fact, when I was brought on at Fast Company, and it was a project that had actually started their migration before I got there, and then I often would get hired as kind of the project managers that come in and bring alignment to a misaligned project. And Fast Company was one of them. And when I got there in August, they explained to me that they were launching in October, and they had to launch in October. And let me explain. They hadn't finished designs. And I was like, oh, true, okay. So essentially, you have to kind of look at what happens, what the back to your evangelist who has sold the project. That's how you fix that problem. So once I identify what the evangelist has been telling everybody, when they're going to get their Drupal implementation, and how much it's going to cost, I try to fix it before it gets to that point. Once I fix what the evangelist has said, I generally no longer have over budget or overrun schedules. So Department of Energy was a massive, huge project, and we were 1 week late based on our original estimate, but that was simply a push out because of the hosting problem, which we identified early. Nobody had a problem with the 1 week delay. Had I not fixed all the folks who were running around selling Drupal and all the stuff that they were telling them, it would have been exactly what you described. So you have to catch the evangelist, because they're the ones who are selling all kinds of crazy dates and budgets. And you have to set real expectations. And once you set the real expectations, no, your project should not go over budget and they should not go over schedule. And they can be run successfully. And I think he's telling me that I'm out of time.
2 minutes.
Any other questions in 2 minutes?
Correct. So you've gone through all the risk assessments in there.
Yeah.
How would you recommend teaching that particular process to developers?
If I can't, well, I have a fortunate, and some of us do, to work with the same developers over and over. and that generally I try to tell and enforce upon the developers I work with that if they don't know something, don't say anything until you talk to me. Said, let us flesh this out first before we talk to our client or we talk to our users. So they may not have the skill, but the one thing that you can do is get them from talking and promising anything. Or saying, hey, that's easy, I can do that. I can get that done in, X amount of time. You have to get them to stop talking in some respect. And it's a terrible thing. When they get more sophisticated, they can start talking as long as they know they're not allowed to promise anything. So that's 2 simple rules. So the first is get them to stop talking initially if they don't have the discipline to not promise anything. And if they're not kind of participating in this high-level kind of project management thought process. Second is if they are comfortable talking and not promising it, definitely, because clients and users love talking to smart developers. And if they can get in there and help flesh out those requirements without saying, this is easy, I could have it done for you next week, and yes. And number 3 is that once you are working with, there are those developers out there who can do all 3. And then once you have all 3, you can let them loose. And then what I then do is I'm kind of the backup person for them. I will send them into a room with users often, and what they'll use is chunking. I call it chunking. This is a low effort. This is a medium effort. This is a high effort. This is risky. They speak in generalities. They give frameworks, but they're still not allowed to give details. I never let them do details until it's actually really fleshed out in a formal discovery. And we're constantly being forced. And so if it's a big discovery and you're kind of running around and you have a lot of moving parts and everybody's talking to each other, you have to have kind of those rules in place if you don't want to get in trouble. But yeah, so if they're not ready, just have them not talking. I know it's terrible, but that's what I do. Good question. Do we use an agile process? Unfortunately, we are not always allowed to use an agile process. We are often given budgets that say, it's a fixed statement projects. On fixed statement projects, so if it's a $50,000 budget and that's all we have, unfortunately, it forces waterfall if they have an expected outcome of what they want. But sometimes someone has $50,000 and they're like, we're willing to be iterative about this and we'll go agile with them. So for us, we can do waterfall, we'll do agile. I mean, we try to push agile as much as possible because that iterative approach is always so much more, I would say, pleasurable for everyone involved, and it's less painful. And actually the client does end up getting, or the users end up getting more of what they want when it is iterative. But we can't always do it. I mean, we're flexible. I would say. So we push agile when we can, but we can't always get it based on budget and timeline on what they expect. So now I think I'm done, right? Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Okay.